All right, thank you, Janet. So with that, I would like to introduce our next speaker. We're going to go ahead and shift gears and talk about cherries now. We're going to be joined by Dr. Terence Robinson, who's going to be telling us about his research growing cherries on dwarfing rootstocks under rain cover. And I believe Terence really needs no introduction, but Terence is an applied fruit crop physiologist at Cornell Agritech in Geneva, New York. And his goal is to solve practical fruit production problems that will increase the profitability and strength of the fruit industry in both New York and the world. With that, I'll go ahead and turn things over to you, Terence.
Okay, thank you, Mike. Pleasure to be with you all today. And I didn't realize you were all going to be forced to stay on for this to get your pesticide credits. But nevertheless, I got to figure out, there we go. I'm pretty enthused about some of the work that we've done over the years on sweet cherries, and I don't find a lot of opportunity to share this research. So I'm excited to try to talk to you because I think there's really some tremendous economic opportunities in sweet cherries in the northeastern part of the country. I want to acknowledge that our work over the years has been funded by IFTA, and I really appreciate their annual funding of this work, and hopefully those of you that are members of IFTA will benefit from some of the research you've funded. I would like to start with just a description of the challenge of growing sweet cherries in a humid climate and a cold climate like New York and other surrounding states. And probably these reasons are the cause of sort of a decline in sweet cherry production. And most of the sweet cherry commercial production is on the West Coast now, California and Washington and Oregon. The first problem is we tend to have greater tree mortality with cherries than we do with apples. There's a saying that cherry trees love to die for a variety of reasons. The rootstocks are susceptible to Phytophthora, and our soils are heavier. And if we have wet falls or wet springs, we tend to get a number of trees dying. Secondly, we suffer from a canker problem that's a bacterial type of canker as contrasted with a fungal type of canker that's most common in peach. In cherry, it's bacterial. And these cause cankers and then oozing and tree decline. Maybe one of the biggest problems that's discouraged people is fruit cracking due to rain. You just get a beautiful cherry crop, and right before you harvest it, half of the fruit splits and really discourages you. We've also had trouble with fruit set in the past and on and off crops. Another reason is that in the past, we haven't been able to grow high density cherries like we've done with apples. And the trees are big and they take a lot of work to prune and a lot of work to pick. We've also had relatively low yields compared to the West Coast. And another problem is that the varieties we've typically grown are relatively small and they're soft. Those are the ones that tend to crack less, but they just can't stand up against those large West Coast cherries that are crunchy. We also have tremendous bird populations, and bird predation is a problem. And lastly, because of our humid climate and we spray for diseases, if you don't have a fungicide on, very close to when you pick, you end up with poor shelf life and a lot of fruit rot. But over the last 20 years, I really started on cherries in 1998, so I guess it's a bit more than 20 years. There has been a number of solutions that have come along and others that we've developed that I think present really a wonderful opportunity to grow sweet cherries in the East. They include dwarfing rootstocks that are not only dwarfing, but also precocious. They include new varieties that are big and crunchy. And they include a suite of management strategies that really change the ballgame. Let me sort of go through what's been discovered and learned about each of these problems. Now, the problem of trees dying in this climate with Phytophthora, we've sort of solved with the introduction of planting trees on raised berms that are about 1 foot high or 30 centimeters high, and that provide increased root oxygenation when the weather is wet in springs or in falls. And they prevent this waterlogging of the root system, which causes phytophthora, but also just asphyxiation of the root system, causing tree death. So I show here a picture on the right of one of our plots, and the berm is relatively wide. Having a very narrow berm is more risky because that can really freeze and get really cold temperatures on the root system, but a relatively wide berm that is about a foot tall at its highest peak, gently sloping to the middle of each of the alleys, has been extremely successful in keeping cherry trees alive. You will note that since these raised berms are more susceptible to drying out in the summer, we do have to use irrigation on cherry trees, but there's a lot of other reasons we use irrigation that I'll talk about when I talk about rain cracking. Now, the second problem with cherries is this bacterial canker, and it is a real problem, especially around pruning cuts. So we've learned never to cut flush on a cherry tree, and I show here in the bottom picture how we're leaving really long stubs, 8-inch long stubs. Those of you that are apple people will note that we often will leave a sort of a stub to get renewal branches on apple with a bevel cut, but with cherry we have to leave much longer stubs. If we get canker infection on that cut, it generally won't progress back into the trunk. Now, often with this long stub, we get 2 or 3 replacement branches. We pick the best one, but we make this rule to ourselves in pruning: never cut a branch off from the trunk without leaving a very long 8-inch stub. The second point is bacterial canker is most active in the spring and in the fall. So we tend to make these major limb cuts right after harvest in late July or early August, when the tree heals quickly and you get much less bacterial canker. Now, lastly, I return to the basic chemical method of controlling bacterial canker, and that is with copper. Cherries, I think, require an intensive copper spray program. We spray 2 sprays in the fall, one at 20% leaf fall and one at 80% leaf fall, especially if the fall is wet, to cover the leaf scars when the leaves fall off. Then we spray 2 additional sprays in the spring. The first one right at bud swell, and then we typically do some pruning right at that time to get ready for the spring. And we spray immediately after pruning to cover all of the pruning cuts. This system has worked very well, except for where copper resistance develops. And that has been shown to be a problem in some orchards. And that's one of the challenges if you get copper resistance to continuing to grow sweet cherries. Number 2, how do you control rain cracking, which is the second biggest problem in the eastern US? Well, it's a series of things. It includes planting up on berms and then installing tile drainage in the middle of each tractor drive. So the berms are wide and they slope down to where the row where the tree's planted to the center of the tractor drive, and we have a subsurface tile line installed in every row, so that water that falls down on the tractor alley can be soaked and removed from the field relatively quickly. But the biggest and best way is with some sort of rain shield. There are really 2 excellent methods. One is with a rain net, as you see here in the bottom picture, where we cover the trees. They can even be big trees with these nets. The best is a vented system that I've really found successful in New York called the Voen, V-O-E-N system. It's relatively expensive, but it works. This diverts rainwater to the alley between the rows. But the last step is managing water near harvest, because if your soil gets relatively dry and then you get a big rainstorm, and even if you divert all that rainwater to the middle of the alley, the roots take up a whole bunch of water, and that still causes cracking. And so we keep the soil almost completely saturated as we get near harvest with daily trickle irrigation, so that when we do get rainstorms, there's not a big change in soil water content. This is some data that we started in our earlier trials. We were comparing unprotected trees, which are the red triangles, the diversion nets, and a calcium chloride spray system, which really didn't work for us. And even in some years, even with nets, we could still get 20, 30% rain cracking. But in most years, we can keep that rain crack percent down to 10% or less. And there's often a big significant difference between trees that are out in the open versus those that have rain nets. Now, rain nets is one option, but another option that's worked very, very well are the high tunnels. Our tunnels come from a company called Haygrove. They're 24 feet diameter bays, and they're about 12 feet to the top of the hoop. And you can see here one of our plots where we have planted, in this case, tall spindle type of trees under these high tunnels. I think that if you're planting cherries today, this is one of the best ways to go. And you can plant one of 3 different styles of tree, the tall spindle style that I show on the left. I don't show the UFO, but I'll show more pictures of that as we go forward with a suggested way to grow trees in the upright fruiting offshoot or UFO system, which can be harvested with platforms. And then on the right picture, I show a bush type of tree with multiple leaders called the KGB, which allows you to pick all the cherries from the ground. Now, each has their respective benefits, and my preference at the moment is the UFO for under tunnels, but also the tall spindle has worked best. I'm much less enthused about the KGB bush trees. I wanted to show some data showing the effect of the tunnel over 5 years on what it did to yield, percent cracked fruit, and the tons per hectare of good fruit and the crop value. So first, the little chart here shows the cumulative yield with no tunnel versus tunnel, and there's a significant greater yield under the tunnel. And that then we combine with the reduced cracking under the tunnel in the second chart, showing somewhere over 5 years, we average about 20% cracked fruit, whereas outside the tunnels, it was almost 50%. And then you convert that yield difference to yield of good fruit over 5 years, and there's a huge benefit from the tunnel in terms of increased yield of good fruit over 5 years. And you convert that to dollars. In this case, it was really about $1.50 a pound, if I remember right. And you convert it to dollars per hectare, you have a huge increase in crop value by using the tunnels. We calculated that with buying the tunnel at the price when we did this study, which was about 2018, that the tunnel would pay for itself in the first 4 cropping years that you had it with improved fruit quality and improved yield. Now, a third aspect of growing cherries that I think is vastly different than it was 20 years ago, and really what enthuses me, is that we're able to grow trees on dwarfing rootstocks, but not only they're dwarfing, but they're also precocious. And then we can implement renewal pruning so that we can keep trees in a much smaller space than we used to dream of. I think the best rootstocks are the Gisela series, and those are the ones that have performed the best for us here at Geneva, New York. We've tested 4 in large scale tests. And in most cases, the most dwarfing, Gisela 3, is too dwarfing for us in New York, and we've had trouble with winter damage on this rootstock. I will note really quickly that in Michigan, Greg Lang had great success with Gisela 3, and I don't truly understand why we've had such poor luck with it, but I'm leery of it because of the winter damage that we've seen. I've had much greater success with Gisela 5, which is really a true dwarf, Gisela 6, which is a semi-dwarf, and Gisela 12, which is a semi-dwarf. We've had more limited experience with Ada Breeze and Crimp 6 and Maxima 14, and so I don't personally recommend them at this point in time. This is some data from one of our long-term trials with 3 Gisela stocks against the old standard, which a Mazard seedling. And you can see that with 3 varieties, Lappins or Regina or Hudson, the tree size after 10 years was huge with Mazard, that's the green bar. And Gisela 12 was substantially less, but still a semi-dwarf. Gisela 5 was even less, and Gisela 6 was less, and Gisela 5 was a true dwarf. Less than half the size of the trees on Mazard when we looked at Lapins, or when we looked at Regina, or when we looked at Hudson. In contrast, the amount of yield we got over those 11 years was huge with any one of the three Gisela stocks compared to what we got with Mazard. And this changes the ball game. If you were trying to make a profit growing sweet cherry trees on Mazard with those relatively low yields of Lapins, even lower on Regina and Hudson, it's just no money in it. But with the high yields that we were getting on the Gisela rootstocks, and you see that with Lapins, there's really no difference between Gisela 5, the blue one, or Gisela 6, red, or Gisela 12, the gray. With Regina, there was a difference where Gisela 5 tended to outperform Gisela 6 and 12. With Hudson, there's essentially no difference between the three Gisela stocks. But with that level of yield, it does become a profitable venture, with a caveat that you can sell cherries for at least $1.50 a pound. And that's one of the issues I'll talk about as I wind up the marketing of this crop, because you have to be able to get $1.50 a pound to make this all work. Well, often people say, what about fruit size? Is fruit size smaller on the Gisela stocks? Well, with these same three varieties, you can see that there is slight differences, but not significant differences in Lapins between Mazard, which in theory gives big fruit size. However, in our case, Gisela 12 had numerically higher fruit. Gisela 6 and 5, essentially the same, statistically the same. If you looked at Regina, which is just naturally a larger cherry, and that's one of the things I really like about Regina for anybody considering to plant cherries, but this is one of the prime varieties to consider. You can see that fruit size was smallest on Mazard. And if you look at Hudson, fruit size was way smaller on Mazard, and the Gisela stocks way outperformed Mazard on fruit size. So I conclude this slide about the differences in the Gisela rootstocks, the three that have performed very well for us in New York. Gisela 5 is the smallest of the three, but it's 3.5 to 4.5 times more productive than trees on seedling rootstocks like Mazard. But because it's a dwarf, it should be planted at much closer spacings than we used to plant cherry trees. So somewhere between 600 and 1,100 trees to the acre. That's somewhere in the neighborhood of 4 to 5 feet in row and 10 to 14 feet between row. But since we're planting on berms and it's a dwarf stock, irrigation is essential to get good fruit size. With some varieties, particularly with the self-fertile varieties like Lapins, you have to use quite aggressive pruning to keep the number of fruits down to a reasonable number so you can get good fruit size. But on the other side of the question, there are some varieties that we call shy croppers. They just don't set very well, and Regina is one of those. But with Gisela 5, it makes a shy cropper into a good cropper. It has been better than any other rootstock for Regina at producing regularly high yields. Now, if I move to Gisela 6, it's more vigorous than Gisela 5. It is really a great rootstock, 3 to 4 times as productive as those on Mazard seedling. But since it's a bigger tree, we suggest that it should be planted between 600 and 800 trees to the hectare, which is somewhere in the neighborhood of 6 to 8 feet in row spacing and 12 to 16 feet between row spacing. We've noted that it seems to have slightly smaller fruit size than either Gisela 5 or 12, but it's really a great rootstock for this upright fruiting offshoot, the UFO system that I'll describe a little more in detail in a minute. The last rootstock that I'm really enthused about is Gisela 12. And I'll tell you one of the reasons. It's a more vigorous rootstock, and it is much more productive than seedling, but it is very good for self-fertile varieties like Lapins or Sweetheart. Those two varieties don't require a pollinator variety, but they set extremely heavy. And Gisela 12 has produced much better fruit size with either Lapins or Sweetheart than has the other rootstocks. So if you're considering those two varieties, then this would be my rootstock of choice. However, because it's more vigorous, it should be planted at somewhere between 600 and 800 trees per hectare. Now let me go on to talk about the way you might grow the trees if you plant these. There are really two types of cherry tree shapes. One is the open center type, well, three types. And we've done this in several styles over the years. The top left picture shows what I call a quad axis, 4 main scaffold branches. And this is very common in Washington State. But the left on the right and on the bottom are 2 bush type trees, the Spanish bush and the KGB. You can plant these at much higher densities. And in theory, pick it all from the ground, because one of the things you do with this system is right after harvest, you hedge the top of it down to whatever height you think you can reach. We hedge to 7 feet tall. And so every year, all the fruit is between your knee height and 7 feet, and you can pick the entire tree from the ground. The only knock I have against this system is that it doesn't seem to be as productive in terms of tons per acre as do the next 2 systems I'll describe. The next group are more central leader, central trunk type of systems. The older style central leader, which we worked on in the late 90s and early 2000s, is a moderately dense orchard. You can see the picture in the upper left. And it has typical sort of central leader structure. We then went to slightly higher densities, which I call the vertical axis at 6 by 14. And we started removing big branches like we do on apple tall spindle, with the main difference being we leave long stubs here, 8-inch long stubs, where an apple we just cut with a bevel cut. Then we moved in the late 2000s and early teens to the tall spindle at 5 by 12. And more recently, we've toyed and fiddled with a super spindle at 2.5 feet by 11. All of them have worked, but I'll show you data in a minute indicating that the tall spindle seems to be the best. The third group of systems are ones where there's some angle to the whole system, either a V system, the 2 types, the V regular or V spindle system, or these 2 systems where you lean the trunk. There's a French system called the Marchand system, and the newer UFO or upright fruiting system, which is allows very high densities, 5 feet by 10. And in this case, you plant the tree at an angle and then train upright shoots off of that angled trunk to produce fruit on. And that's why it's called upright fruiting offshoots. Well, let me show you a little bit about why planting higher density is so important. We had this one experiment where we had 3 densities between 600 and 1,000 trees per hectare. And regardless of which rootstock you were planting on, the closer you planted the trees, the more yield you got. Now, this shows very clearly the red line being Mazard had way lower yield no matter how close you planted the trees, whereas the 3 Gisela stocks had much higher yield, 4 or 5 times as much yield as Mazard regardless. But in all cases, to get the highest yield possible, you had to plant one of these Gisela stocks at high planting densities. Well, some people are worried that planting trees closer together will give smaller fruit size, but we found there is a small effect of that. And you can see as you went from 600 trees to 1,000, there's a slight negative slope to the line of both the Gisela 6, Gisela 12, a lesser negative slope to Gisela 5, and no negative slope to Mazard. But these Gisela stocks just give better fruit size all around than Mazard. And so even if there's some small penalty, it's relatively small. And the increased yield is worth much more. Because when we looked at crop value over 11 years, we came up with these. Now you can plant relatively low density and still make more money than on the Gisela stocks than you can on Mazard. But if you combine Gisela stocks with high density, then you make even more money. And particularly was this black line with Gisela 5, which at high density had the highest crop value. Now I'll show you why that's important as we get to the end of this and we look at what I'm going to suggest that you should do. Now, a second trial that we had, which was really interesting, we also had Gisela 3 in it, and we had 4 different systems. The bush type, KGB, which are the blue bars, the tall spindle, which is one of the ones I've really liked, the UFO, which is the gray one, and then super spindle, which is that 2.5 feet between trees system. Now, when we looked at the way the trees grew, the Gisela 3 trees, regardless of which system, were smaller than the Gisela 5, and they were smaller than Gisela 6, which we've already talked about. But when we looked at cumulative yield over 10 years, and this is with Regina, Gisela 3 had generally lower yield than Gisela 5, and Gisela 5 had the highest compared to Gisela 6. And so that's why we focus in on Gisela 5 for growing high-density cherries under tunnels. In this particular case, the tall spindle on Gisela 5 had the highest yield. That was followed by the UFO, and the super spindle, and then the KGB, the blue bars, had the lowest. When we looked at average fruit size, there was smaller fruit with Gisela 3, but Gisela 5 and 6 had very similar fruit size, with the best fruit size coming off of the UFO and the super spindle. Now I want to switch to another problem, and that is sometimes with the Gisela stocks, you get too many fruits. The crop load is too high. We've tested chemical thinning on these cherries quite a bit. And so I do list that chemical thinning with ATS has helped, but it's such a short season crop, only about 60 days from bloom to harvest. Once you get too many fruits set after bloom, there's almost no way to recover. So the best way to manage excessive crop on cherries is through pruning. And so we've talked about precision pruning on apple. Well, similarly on cherry, we end up precision pruning with slightly different rules. If you have a variety that's self-fertile, like Lapins or like Sweetheart, we want to remove small diameter twigs. And you can see this little twig in the bottom picture. It's only about 5 inches long, but it's covered with flower buds. And that's just too many flower buds. And so what that often happens on some of the shoots on Gisela 5 on high, self-fertile varieties. And so we have to prune those off, leaving more of these buds on the spurs on bigger shoots. We also can remove whole branches to reduce the crop load, but also we end up stubbing new shoots. Now this picture illustrates the problem. As you get to the end of a particular year's growth, you have a whole cluster of flowering spurs on it the next year. When you have new shoots grow out the following year, you have this cluster of spurs. If, however, you take these 1-year shoots and you cut off the distal third, you remove this big clump and you're left with more spaced out spurs, which produce better fruit size. So that's the type of pruning we do, particularly when we have self-fertile varieties. Where we have other varieties that are shy croppers, like Regina, we don't have to do that kind of pruning. Now, I would add that we do try to keep nitrogen up on cherries, and planting on berms has given us continued vigor and irrigation. Now, the other problem that sometimes crops up, particularly with Regina, is low fruit set. And so it's a beautiful cherry, but if you're carrying a light crop, that doesn't make sense economically either. But we discovered about a dozen years ago that it's probably due to the short life of the ovule. And so the flowers open, and before pollen can be transferred to the flower and then grow down the pistil and fertilize the egg dies. And so we discovered that if you spray Retain, which is an anti-ethylene product, at the popcorn stage, it improves ovule longevity and improves fruit set. It's a very early timing, and I show here this picture because this is the exact timing we want to spray Retain, and many growers often miss it and wait till full bloom, where there's one blossom or two in a whole bunch that are open, 1 or 2 out of 100, that's the moment to spray while all the others are at popcorn stage. So our recommendation is to apply, I like 2 pouches of Retain. It's more expensive, but it seems to work more or better and more consistently. 1 or 2 pouches. When the very first flower opens on Regina, that's when 98% of all the other flowers are still at popcorn stage. So I've gone through a number of management strategies to how to grow cherries. And I put them all together in this slide showing what are our recommendations for this system of growing successfully sweet cherries in the East. I think the key thing is to plant varieties that can compete with West Coast cherries. They have to be large and crunchy. And the ones I've listed here, I think fit the bill. Regina is one of my favorites, but 2 new ones, or 3 new ones from Bob Anderson here at Cornell are Black Pearl, Burgundy Pearl, and Ebony Pearl. We've also had very good success with Lapins, which is a self-fertile out of British Columbia. We've had really good luck with some light colored, we call them yellow cherries with a red blush or blush cherries. And one that's worked extremely well is Rainier, and an early version of Rainier called Early Robin. So those would be the sequence of varieties that I would suggest. The earliest in this group is Black Pearl, followed by Burgundy Pearl, Ebony Pearl, and Rainier, and then Lapins. Well, Early Robin's in with the early group. Then Lapins and Regina would be the last one. You should plant high densities, and planting under tunnels really lends itself to high density. Dwarfing rootstocks. I love Gisela 5 for Regina, and under tunnels, I'd probably plant everything on Gisela 5. But for some of the self-fertiles like Lapins, Gisela 12 seems to have done a little better at fruit size. We don't do a lot of pruning in the first 4 years. There's a specific technique we call bud removal to obtain the required branching, but we don't do very much pruning. Rain protection is essential, nets or tunnels. I feel that in our heavier soils in the East, more clay, we have to get the roots up out of the wet in the spring and in the fall. And so berms plus tiling down every row seem to help a lot. You have to control bacterial canker, prune very little in the spring, spray coppers both fall and spring. Retain to improve fruit set, irrigation to manage both fruit size and to prevent this fluctuation in soil moisture from rainfall, which causes cracking. And then GA sprays help improve firmness and bird protection or bird nets. Let me show you what I would do if I was planting cherries today. This is a suggested optimal spacing under a high tunnel when you are going to train the trees in a narrow fruiting wall called UFO on Gisela 5 rootstock. I would plant them 5 feet in row and 8 feet between the rows, with 3 rows under each tunnel bay. Now, the tunnels we've put up are 24 feet in diameter. I know there's some 26-foot tunnels that would make it even a little better. But in this case, with 3 rows, there's only 4 feet between the outside row and the edge of the tunnel. The center row is exactly underneath the peak of the tunnel. And then another row, only 4 feet from the edge. That gives only 8 feet drive row. But you can spray with a narrow tractor in this 8-foot drive row, because as you see in the actual pictures below, it's a very narrow fruiting wall. Especially this picture on the right shows how the tree is developed. It's planted at an angle and then bent down horizontal, and then an upright fruiting branch is trained up till you get 8 or 9 or 10 feet tall. This allows you to manage 3 rows under 1 tunnel bay. The spacing along the row is 5 feet because I tried to draw it here. You have this horizontal main stem of the tree and then the uprights off of it, so that as you see down here in the lower picture, you only have 5 feet between the trees, and you have somewhere about 8 to 10 of these upright fruiting branches on every tree. This gives a relatively high tree density of about 1,000 trees to the acre. Now, it's relatively expensive because trees on Gisela rootstock are a little more expensive than trees on Mazard, but the extra production, and at this tree density, the amount of production you can get is just phenomenal. And you've got rain protection from the tunnel. Now, one important also point is the labor efficiency, because you can use a platform down this very narrow row and pick off of a platform, Or if you have U-pick, they can also do the bottom part of the tree well, and you can pick the upper part with a platform. But it allows very efficient picking compared to a three-dimensional tree. I do have to say that we've had great success with a more three-dimensional tree in a tall spindle format with Gisela 5 under high tunnels. In this case, we only use 2 rows because there's a three dimensions to the trees and you can't really fit 3 rows. In this case, we still use 5 feet between the upright trunks along the row, but there's a little more space between the edge of the tunnel and the first row. There's 12 feet to drive tractors, and then more space for walking along the inside of that row next to the tunnel wall. And I showed 2 pictures of the way that's worked for us here. I put this up because I wanted to illustrate that at this spacing, 5 by 12 in a tunnel, you're still quite high in terms of tree density at 725, but you're not close to the 1,000 like you are with the UFO. That's why I prefer, if you're going to invest in a tunnel, to maximize the use of every square foot in that tunnel by planting higher density in the UFO format. Now, what about managing high tunnels? Well, first point is we generally wait to cover or skin the tunnel till right after fruit set, because bees don't tend to work well under the tunnel for fertilizing flowers. They get disoriented. We also use trickle irrigation under the tunnel because we're keeping rainwater off. And so all the water we're supplying comes from trickle. And you can see the trickle spots down here in this picture. Now, for yellow cherries with a red blush like Rainier, which is a fabulous, crunchy, big cherry, we have to use reflective fabric like Extende, as I've shown in this picture below. And with that, we tend to get very good yellow or red blush on those yellow cherries. We then remove the plastic, or basically roll it up in a coil, a cord along the top of the tunnel where we cover it in black plastic for the rest of the year, as soon as harvest is over. So the trees go through most of the year without plastic over the tunnel. This is critical that you not leave the plastic up during the winter. First, they're not made for snow load, but the problem really is that they heat up in the winter and they de-harden the trees. And so in the middle of the winter, you can get the trees susceptible to just a normal cold snap. So do not ever try to keep those tunnels covered in the summer or in the winter. Now, with that said, I wanted to also comment that cherries tend to be more winter hardy than peach. New York is on the upper northern limits for peach production, and maybe this year we've lost peach buds. I still haven't checked, but many years we do lose peach buds in the winter, but we almost never lose cherry buds here at Geneva. Now, certainly in the Champlain Valley, it's much more iffy with cherries, where we lose peach buds every year, but certainly most of the rest of the eastern production area can grow cherries and have them come through the winter fine. I want to summarize with this slide. I think there's an opportunity for growing sweet cherries, especially if you have a farm market or you want to supply other farm markets. Some farm markets just don't want to mess with them, and we've had good success with growers around Geneva supplying others and making a good profit from sweet cherries. But if you want to grow cherries, you have to use new varieties that are firm and crunchy if you want to compete with West Coast cherries. And you have to use dwarfing rootstocks, not only because they're dwarfing, but because they're just so much more productive and precocious than the seedlings. And I believe you have to use rain protection. Now, high tunnels is a great way, but also the vented net system is another great way. It turns out they're about the same cost. If you use a high tunnel, you want to maximize every square foot. And so planting high tree densities is essential, but planting on berms and then tiling will help keep trees alive and help reduce rain cracking. With the use of retain to improve fruit set, we can get excellent annual yields. With irrigation, we can get great fruit size, but you have to be able to charge $1.50 or more a pound per cherries, or don't even attempt it. If you can get $2 or $2.50 a pound, you can make a lot of money with sweet cherries, either at your own farm market or supplying other farm markets. I want to end by saying a number of people have tried cracking into the wholesale market with a major supermarket chains, Price Chopper, Wegmans, Walmart, whatever. But they are really tied to the West Coast cherry producers, and it's been difficult for local people to crack into those. But maybe you could. But nevertheless, there's great opportunities in the farm market sector for local grown sweet cherries if they're not cracked and if they're big and crunchy. So with that summary slide, I'll end my presentation and be happy to answer any questions you might have.
All right. Thank you very much, Terrence, for a great presentation. We do have some questions in the chat box. And if you do have questions, please go ahead and type them in there, and we will do our best to get those answered. I also do want to just announce that for those of you that are seeking New York recertification credits, we went ahead and put that exit survey into the chat box as well. So before you leave, please go ahead and make sure you click on that, enter your information again for you to receive those credits. So Terrence, we have a question from Jacob. Does Rainier cherry grow well in New York? And someone also asked about the winter hardiness of Rainier in New York.
It grows wonderful in New York. So it's been one of the real rain crack problems. And so I loved Rainier when I used to live in Washington. And we never thought it could do well until we started growing them in tunnels or under rain nets. And we've just had fabulous luck at Geneva with it. Now, the marketing is a different question. There's some people that just want dark cherries. On these light colored yellow cherries with a red blush, they don't think are that great. But Rainier is fabulously sweet, and it's big and it's crunchy. So you would develop your market for it. But in terms of its survivability in New York, it has done fantastic.
All right, great. Thank you. We have another question. Are the Gisela rootstocks good for tart cherries in your experience?
So that's a two-part answer. The first is if you're a commercial tart cherry grower that's going to shake them and send them off to a processing plant, not too many people have wanted to plant on Gisela because the cherry harvesters are built for these big spacings, and you would need to plant Gisela closer. However, there's a big project that several of us in the US have on planting them closer on Gisela stocks with an over-the-row harvester like a blueberry harvester. And there's a few people that are trying that, but it's not really well accepted. But if you're a farm marketer growing tart cherries to sell in your farm market, absolutely, Gisela is a great rootstock. And in that case, Gisela 6 has been the best for us. But Gisela 12 is almost equally as good.
All right, thank you. Following up on that a little bit, what are the best tree combinations that you recommend for Gisela 5, 6, and 12 with the new cherry cultivars that are coming out of New York?
So the 3 pearl series, black pearl, ebony pearl, and burgundy pearl, all tend to be a little bit of a shy cropper. Hence, I like them on Gisela 5 more than Gisela 6 or Gisela 12. So that's specifically my answer to those 3 new ones out of Cornell that are called the Pearl series. I will add that there is a blush one in that series called Radiance Pearl, and it's also a great cherry. But if you're talking about self-fertile cherries, and 2 really good ones are Lapins and Sweetheart, and then there's a 3rd one that I haven't let us grow in New York, and so I'm not going to mention it. But those tend to do best on Gisela 12 because we get better fruit size and they don't set quite so heavily. On Gisela 5, they tend to always overset.
All right, thank you. How do you manage renewal pruning on the UFO system for cherries?
That's a very good question, and that's still to be worked out. So we're growing these 8 to 10 uprights on every tree when they're spaced 5 feet apart. And as we go through time, some of them they get different diameters, some sort of more vigorous than others. And so what we start to do after about year 5 is take out 1 per year that's the most vigorous. If some of them stay small, I would say less than 1.5 inches in diameter, we just keep cropping them indefinitely. But often they do start to get very large in diameter because cherry is a forest tree. And then we start the process of taking out 1 per year and trying to train up a replacement shoot.
All right, thank you, Terrence. What varieties do not produce well under a UFO system? varieties that need time to develop spurs, for example?
So the ones that are spurry, they're the best ones for the UFO, because when you can produce an upright shoot that's just covered with spurs like Lapins or Sweetheart, they just produce and produce and produce on those spurs. We've been less successful with varieties that don't produce many spurs, and the most notable of those is Regina. So with Regina, we've had to modify slightly the UFO strategy we do. And so in a 5-foot spacing with Lapins or these spurry types, we might have 10 uprights. With Regina, we might have only 5 uprights because we have to leave some side branch development on Regina to grow out and produce cherries on, instead of just a column of spurs like we can do with Lapins. So those intricacies I could certainly talk about. We certainly probably should put out a written paper with all those little details, but it certainly requires slightly different strategy on a UFO where we don't have spurs. But I think it could work with any variety with tweaking.
All right, thank you, Terrence. Are there any major or notable differences in growing apricots versus the other stone fruits in New York?
Well, the biggest difference is we tend to lose apricots to spring frost much more regularly than we do cherries. They just bloom earlier, and we just have 8 years out of 10 where we lose apricots, excepting in very specific frost-protected areas. And some of the places along the Finger Lakes where they grow grapes have been quite successful growing apricots. But apricots tend to survive the winter. The buds do, as well as cherries, much better than peach, but they bloom earlier than peach and earlier than sweet cherries, and so we almost always lose them to spring frost.
How do you manage frost protection when you're growing the cherries under the tunnels?
So that's a 2-part answer as well. We tend to just rely on the fact that they're well adapted to Western New York and the Hudson Valley. And so we can often get by without much frost protection. Now in the Hudson Valley, we require more frost protection than in Western New York because sweet cherries bloom a little bit later than peach. And so we often do well without any frost protection. But there is a possibility to skin the tunnels before bloom to try to use frost protection within the tunnel to protect them. This is complicated. So people have used heaters underneath those tunnels to protect cherry blossoms during frost events. But then getting the bees to fly to pollinate the crop is problematic. Honeybees don't like it, but bumblebees have been fairly successful. So we tend in our tunnels, even though we don't skin them till after bloom, we use bumblebees also and honeybees to pollinate. So it is possible to use the tunnel, skin it before the bloom to protect against frost, and put heaters in there and close the ends.
All right, thank you. What are your thoughts on Skeena?
I like Skeena, but it's just not an outstanding cherry for me like these other ones that I listed on there. We have quite a few Skeena planted here at the station, and it's a nice cherry, but it's not big and crunchy.
All right, thank you. Let's see, I'll take one more here. No nurseries are currently budding Gisela 5. Do you have any recommendations, any secrets?
Well, I'm not sure that that's exactly true. I think there are nurseries that will bud Gisela 5 for you. And it just takes a little bit of planning ahead and requesting that, because all the cherry rootstocks are produced by tissue culture. And they just need a year in advance to get Gisela 5 produced and in their nursery if you're going to put an order.
All right, and then we had a grower say they've had good pollination under the Vone cover. And another grower had said that for the Gisela 5 question, you need to be willing to order 1,000 trees of a variety to get that one. It seems to be the case for them.
I hadn't been watching who put the questions up, but I'm sure that question on the Vone came from Chuck Mead, because one of the trials we put up several of these around the state. One was at his farm. And if the Vone covers are this vented net, and so they don't provide much frost protection. But if you close them, there's a little bit, and the bees tend to fly underneath that better than they will under a plastic tunnel, a high tunnel. There's more space, they're taller, they're higher. Now, the 1,000 tree minimum, that might be true. But I think that you could have your favorite nurseryman work with you. Now, I just heard recently, Waffler Nursery here in New York said they're going to be growing cherries again.
All right, that's great to know. I don't see any other questions coming in, so I think we're going to end things there. Just again, a reminder, if you haven't filled out that survey for the DEC credit yet, please do so before you leave. I'd like to thank you, Terence, for joining us today for an excellent presentation and great Q&A section. And I'd like to thank you all for joining us today. And we'll see you at some of our spring meetings, hopefully. So take care.